The courtroom didn't just erupt when the judge offered his veiled insult. It held its breath first, watching Jasmine Crockett decide what the price of dignity would be in that moment. The air in courtroom 301 was thick, not just with the stale, recirculated HVAC chill, but with the unspoken tension that precedes significant public moments. Jasmine sat perfectly still at the defense table, her hands clasped lightly atop a stack of thick legal binders. The murmur of the gallery faded, replaced by the sharp tap-tap-tapping of the court reporter's machine, a metronome for the measured pace of justice, or perhaps just another day. Judge Thompson, a man whose face seemed permanently set in a mold of weary self-importance, cleared his throat, the sound amplified by the courtroom's acoustics. He wasn't looking at Jasmine directly. His gaze swept over the assembled reporters, the curious onlookers, the rows of aides and staffers perched behind the main tables. The case itself was complex, rooted in regulatory law and corporate accountability, a landscape where power often disguised itself in labyrinthine legal text. But the undercurrent in this particular hearing had shifted days ago, away from the dry procedural arguments and towards the personalities involved, specifically the one outlier in a room full of familiar pale faces. Jasmine, a woman whose presence demanded notice not through loudness but through an undeniable stillness, a quiet authority that felt both ancient and urgently present. Judge Thompson leaned forward, his voice dropping slightly, adopting a tone that was superficially collegial but laced with something else, something that prickled at the edges of awareness. He spoke of the need for decorum, for respecting the traditions of the court, standard fare until his eyes flickered, just for a fraction of a second towards Jasmine. He didn't name her. He didn't have to. Some participants, he said, his voice carrying just enough for everyone to hear, seem more interested in, shall we say, performance than the sober administration of justice. This is not a theater. This is a court of law, with centuries of tradition. Let us remember that. The words hung there, seemingly innocuous, a general admonishment. But the context, the slight pause before performance, the almost imperceptible shift in his posture, the way a ripple went through the front row of reporters, scribbling furiously, it all pointed one way. It was a microaggression disguised as a procedural reminder, a coded jab designed to belittle, to question her legitimacy not on legal grounds, but on something far more insidious. Jasmine didn't flinch. Her expression remained unreadable, a placid surface over depths unseen. Her eyes, dark and steady, remained fixed on the judge, not with defiance but with an unnerving calm. The reporter in the second row, a young woman named Sarah who covered the Hill beat and had seen this kind of thing before, stopped writing. She looked up, not at the judge but at Jasmine. Her gaze was sharp, observant. She saw not anger or hurt in Jasmine's face but something colder, harder. Evaluation. As if Jasmine were processing the statement, cataloging it, placing it precisely where it belonged. The silence that followed the judge's comment stretched, just long enough to feel significant. It wasn't awkward silence. It was charged silence, the kind where everyone waits to see who will break it and how. The judge settled back in his chair, a faint, almost smug satisfaction playing on his lips. He'd thrown his stone into the pond. Now he waited for the ripples. But the ripples weren't what he expected. Jasmine didn't rise. She didn't object. She didn't offer a passionate defense of her character or her intentions. She simply continued to look at him, her gaze unwavering. Beside her, a young legislative aide, Maya, shifted in her seat, her eyes darting from Jasmine to the judge, a silent question in her expression. She'd worked for Jasmine for 2 years and had seen her navigate countless subtle attacks, but never one so public, so thinly veiled. And from the bench itself, Maya's hand instinctively went to her phone in her pocket, a nervous reflex. She knew the rules. No recording in the courtroom. But the feeling of the moment, the way the air felt brittle, told her this wasn't just a moment in a hearing. It was the moment. The gallery remained hushed. No one coughed. No one fidgeted audibly. All eyes were on the woman who had just been subtly but undeniably targeted by the authority figure in the room. And she was doing nothing. Or rather, she was doing exactly what she intended. Her stillness was not passive. It was active. It was a refusal to be drawn into the manufactured drama. a refusal to legitimize the premise of the attack by reacting to it on its terms. It was, in its own quiet way, a strike. Not outward, but inward, a centering, a gathering of strength that those watching could almost feel radiating from her. The judge finally broke the silence, calling the next witness. The sound of his voice felt jarring after the intensity of the pause. Business resumed, the dry legal arguments flowing again, but the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. The air still held the charge of what had just happened, a live wire hum beneath the surface of the proceedings. Everyone in the room knew they had witnessed something, but they weren't yet sure what. Was it a deliberate provocation, a Freudian slip of institutional bias, and more importantly, what would come next from the person who had absorbed the blow with such impenetrable calm? The silence that followed Jasmine's non-reaction wasn't empty. It was full of potential energy, waiting for the precise moment of release. The procedural arguments dragged on, but for those who had caught the exchange, the focus had irrevocably shifted. Every witness testimony, every cross-examination, every sidebar conference was now filtered through the lens of the judge's comment and Jasmine's silence. The reporters continued to write, but their notes now included timestamps and minute details of Jasmine's demeanor. Sat erect, hands still, eyes tracking witness calmly. Sarah, the reporter, glanced down at her phone under the table, quickly typing a message to her editor. Judge Thompson made veiled comment about Crockett performance during regulatory hearing. She didn't react. Air in courtroom is thick. Potential story here. The editor's reply was instant. Eyes on her. Get everything. Meanwhile, behind Jasmine, Maya watched not just the proceedings, but the reactions of others in the gallery. She saw a few nods of understanding, a few tight-lipped expressions of disapproval directed at the judge, and a lot of uncertainty. Some people clearly hadn't caught the nuance of the judge's words, or perhaps hadn't wanted to. The power of a coded message, Maya realized, lay in its deniability for the aggressor, and its isolating ambiguity for the target. But the deniability was thin here, transparent to anyone paying attention. Jasmine remained the picture of composure. She consulted briefly with the lead counsel from the law firm representing the committee she chaired, a seasoned lawyer named Mr. Davison. Their exchange was quiet, efficient. Davison, a man who'd seen his share of courtroom theatrics and bias disguised as procedure, gave Jasmine a brief, almost imperceptible nod. It was a gesture of solidarity, of recognition. He hadn't missed it either. He knew the game the judge was playing, and he knew Jasmine's strength lay not in playing by her opponent's rules, but in changing the game entirely. He trusted her judgment implicitly. The judge, perhaps sensing the shift in the room, or perhaps simply moving on with his docket, seemed to exert a slightly more formal control over the proceedings. His questions to witnesses became more pointed, his rulings on objections faster, sharper. He projected an image of being purely focused on the law, a deliberate contrast to the performance he'd subtly accused Jasmine of seeking. It was a classic tactic. Accuse your target of your own perceived failing or weakness. Jasmine, however, didn't give him anything to work with. She didn't interrupt. She didn't grandstand during her brief opportunities to speak, which were limited, as the witness testimony was controlled by others. When she did interject, it was with precise, legally sound questions that cut directly to the heart of the matter, delivered in a cool, clear voice that showed no trace of the emotional impact the judge's words might have intended. Her questions weren't just effective legally, they were rhetorically powerful, dismantling the narrative the witness was presenting piece by piece, line by line. Each question was a quiet assertion of her competence, her focus, her absolute commitment to the actual work of the court, a stark counterpoint to the judge's thinly veiled accusation of triviality or self-promotion. She wasn't striking back with anger. She was striking back with undeniable substance. This was the essence of her power, turning the opponent's attack into an opportunity to showcase the very quality they attempted to deny her. The visual symbol of her stillness, juxtaposed with the nervous energy of others, became more potent as the hours passed. While lawyers shuffled papers, witnesses shifted in the stand, and the judge tapped his pen. Jasmine sat like a statue carved from determination, only her eyes moving, tracking the flow of information. It was a masterclass in restraint, a performance of anti-performance that was, in its own way, far more compelling than any outburst could have been. People in the gallery leaned forward, captivated by her sheer control. They weren't just watching a legal proceeding anymore. They were watching a study in human resilience and strategic non-engagement. The judge's attempt to diminish her had inadvertently elevated her, making her the magnetic center of the room, simply by highlighting her presence and then watching her refuse to react on command. The subtle ripple of attention had become a quiet tide. The hearing continued into the afternoon. Breaks offered moments of hushed conversation in the corridors. Reporters huddled, comparing notes, their whispers focused on the judge's comment and Jasmine's response. Sarah overheard snippets. "Did you hear what he said?" Totally aimed at her. "Can't believe she didn't say anything." But that was the response, wasn't it? The consensus was building. The judge had crossed a line, and Jasmine's non-reaction was the most powerful reaction possible. Inside the courtroom during a brief recess, Maya approached Jasmine cautiously, holding a small water bottle. "Are you okay?" she murmured, her voice low. Jasmine took the water, her fingers brushing Maya's. "I'm fine, Maya," Jasmine said, her voice calm, almost dismissive of the concern. But her eyes, as she looked at Maya, held a deeper understanding. "He wants a reaction. He wants me to validate his premise by getting emotional, by defending myself against a baseless accusation. We don't give him that." It was a quiet lesson, delivered in the eye of the storm. Maya nodded, processing the strategic depth. It wasn't just about feeling okay. It was about denying the aggressor the intended outcome of their aggression. It was about power, and who controlled the narrative. Jasmine's power came from refusing to participate in the false narrative. Back in session, the temperature in the room felt different. The judge's earlier comment, though not explicitly addressed, hung in the air like smoke. Every ruling he made, every question he asked, was now viewed through the prism of potential bias. His authority, while legally absolute within the courtroom, felt subtly undermined by the perceived unfairness of his earlier remark. He seemed aware of this, his posture stiffening, his tone becoming almost artificially neutral. He was trying to regain the ground he'd lost, not through legal error, but through a lapse in judicial impartiality that everyone had witnessed. Jasmine, meanwhile, continued her steady, focused work. She conferred with Mr. Davison, passed notes, reviewed documents. Her presence remained a quiet anchor in the swirling undercurrents of the room. The contrast between her deliberate calm and the judge's now slightly strained formality was stark. The visual symbol of her folded hands on the table, still and grounded, spoke volumes against the subtle fidgeting of the judge's fingers on his pen, the slight tension in his shoulders. The public nature of the setting amplified the stakes of the microaggression. It wasn't a private slight. It was delivered from a position of immense institutional power, intended to land with the weight of that authority. But by refusing to give it the emotional weight it craved, Jasmine had subtly deflected that power. She hadn't just absorbed the blow, she had rendered it ineffective by demonstrating its irrelevance to the actual work at hand. The themes of the style guide were playing out in real time. The microaggression, the institutional power dynamic, Jasmine's choice of silence as a form of public clarity and strength. Her restraint wasn't born of fear or passivity, but of a profound, almost radical self-possession. She owned her reaction, or lack thereof, completely. The emotional rhythm shifted again. The initial shock of the judge's words had given way to the tension of waiting for Jasmine's response, which had then settled into a quiet awe at her composure. Now, a new rhythm emerged, one of observation, of dissecting the power play unfolding before them, of recognizing that the real action wasn't in the spoken words, but in the strategic silences and the unspoken intentions. The courtroom audience wasn't just watching a legal hearing. They were watching a masterclass in navigating public disrespect with grace and intelligence. The judge had tried to trap her in a moment of emotional reactivity, a common tactic used to dismiss or undermine women, particularly women of color in professional settings. But Jasmine had refused the bait. She had redefined the battlefield, making it about substance and control, not manufactured drama. And in doing so, she was slowly, surely, changing the dynamics of the room. The seed of the public reckoning was being planted, not through an explosion, but through the quiet, steady drip of undeniable dignity. As the late afternoon sun slanted through the tall courtroom windows, painting stripes across the worn carpet, the hearing finally approached its conclusion for the day. The final witness was dismissed. Judge Thompson gathered his papers, his movements slightly more deliberate now, as if consciously performing the role of the impartial, weary dispenser of justice. He announced the adjournment, setting the schedule for the following day. As he spoke, his gaze lingered for a fraction of a second too long on Jasmine. It wasn't a look of challenge or anger, but something more complex. Perhaps a flicker of frustration that his earlier maneuver hadn't yielded the desired result, or perhaps even a grudging, unacknowledged respect for her impenetrable composure. Jasmine, however, gave nothing away. She simply gathered her own documents, her movements precise and economical. The moment the judge announced, "Court is adjourned," a buzz erupted in the gallery. Reporters scrambled for their phones, typing rapidly, sharing the day's events with their newsrooms. Onlookers began to gather their belongings, many casting curious glances towards Jasmine. Maya was already by Jasmine's side, helping to pack binders into a briefcase. As they worked, Mr. Davison leaned in. "Impressive, Jasmine," he murmured, his voice low. "Very impressive. You handled that beautifully." Jasmine gave a slight, almost imperceptible inclination of her head in acknowledgement. "It wasn't about handling it in the moment, Mr. Davison," she replied softly, but clearly enough for Maya to hear. "It's about handling the narrative that comes after the moment." This was the core of her strategy, the delayed rhetorical hammer. She wasn't fighting the moment itself. She was preparing to shape its meaning for the world outside the courtroom walls. The doors to the courtroom opened, and the stream of people exited into the busy courthouse corridor. Reporters immediately converged on Mr. Davison, asking questions about the case, but their eyes kept flicking towards Jasmine. They knew the real story of the day wasn't the regulatory details. It was the unspoken drama they had witnessed. Jasmine moved deliberately, not rushing but not lingering. She exchanged brief, polite nods with a few colleagues from opposing counsel. She projected an aura of calm professionalism, utterly disconnected from the subtle firestorm that had just occurred. Out in the corridor, away from the strict rules of the courtroom, the phones came out. People who had witnessed the moment were texting, calling, posting to private groups. The story was beginning to spread, filtered through the lens of individual perception but coalescing around the central event. The judge's comment. Jasmine's silence. Sarah, the reporter, stood slightly apart from the scrum around Mr. Davison, watching Jasmine. She saw the quiet strength in her posture, the way she didn't seem rattled or upset. This wasn't a performance. It was simply how Jasmine was under pressure. Sarah quickly drafted a tweet. Subtle but unmistakable moment in Judge Thompson's court today. Judge made veiled comment about performance seemingly directed at a Rep. Jasmine Crockett. Her reaction. Complete unwavering composure. Hearing adjourned. Story unfolding. She hesitated for a second, then hit send. The tweet went out into the digital ether, a tiny stone thrown into the vast pond of social media. The ripples would be instantaneous and unpredictable. Maya, walking just behind Jasmine, saw several people in the corridor openly looking at Jasmine with expressions ranging from sympathy to admiration. One young woman, a law student observing the proceedings, gave Jasmine a small, discreet thumbs up. It was a silent acknowledgement of shared understanding, a recognition of the coded language, and the strength required to face it down publicly. Jasmine offered a faint, brief smile in return. It was a micro-action that spoke volumes, a connection forged in the shared experience of navigating spaces where belonging is constantly being subtly challenged. The energy of the moment was building, moving beyond the confines of courtroom 301. The silence that followed the insult was over. Now came the sound of keyboards clacking, of messages being sent, of the narrative beginning its rapid decentralized journey through the digital landscape. The judge's attempt to control the room with a veiled insult had, ironically, created the very spectacle he seemed to disdain, not because Jasmine had created drama, but because her refusal to do so had highlighted the drama of his own action. The stage had expanded. The audience was no longer limited to those in the room. Within minutes of Sarah's tweet and similar messages spreading through other channels, the digital world began to hum. News outlets picked up the buzz. Bloggers started writing. The phrase, "Judge Thompson performance comment," began trending. Short cell phone videos, secretly recorded despite court rules, a recurring problem in high-profile hearings, started appearing, grainy and shaky, but capturing the crucial moments. The judge's slight pause, his glance towards Jasmine, the beat of silence that followed. These raw clips, though low quality, were powerful because they offered unvarnished evidence of the subtle attack. Social media platforms became a rapid-fire courtroom of public opinion. Initial reactions were a mix of outrage at the judge's perceived bias and awe at Jasmine's composure. "Did you see that? The disrespect." That stare from Rep. Jasmine Crockett spoke volumes. Judges should be impartial, period. He thought he was being slick. She didn't even flinch. The narrative was solidifying. A powerful figure had used his position to issue a coded insult, and a composed, dignified woman had met it with silence, turning his aggression into a spotlight on his own behavior. The quiet intensity of the courtroom had translated into the explosive energy of the internet. Memes began to appear, featuring screenshots of Jasmine's calm face juxtaposed with quotes about handling disrespect. Hashtags emerged: dignity under pressure, Crockett composure, judicial bias. The story wasn't just spreading, it was being interpreted, amplified, and given new layers of meaning by a global audience. The viral moment had arrived. Not a single explosion, but a million tiny echoes of the silence Jasmine had held. The power dynamic was visibly flipping in the public sphere. While the judge's action remained within the legal boundaries of the courtroom, thin as they were, its interpretation outside those walls was overwhelmingly negative. He was being judged by a different court, one that valued authenticity and fairness over institutional pretense. His attempt to subtly undermine Jasmine had, in the harsh light of social media, backfired spectacularly, highlighting his own lack of decorum and professionalism. Jasmine, meanwhile, remained offline. Maya was monitoring the situation, reporting key developments to Jasmine's communications team. The team was receiving a deluge of requests for comment from media outlets across the country. The story had legs. It was no longer just a courtroom incident, but a potent symbol of the challenges faced by marginalized voices in positions of power, and a testament to the strength required to navigate them. The strategy of not reacting in the moment was proving brilliant in the aftermath. By denying the judge the satisfaction of seeing her rattled, Jasmine had preserved her emotional energy and her credibility. She hadn't engaged in a shouting match. She had simply continued to exist, powerfully and calmly, in the space he seemed to want to shrink, and the world was noticing. The viral quote that began to circulate most widely wasn't something Jasmine said in court, but something she had said quietly to Maya during the break, which Maya had relayed to the comms team, recognizing its power. "He wants a reaction. We don't give him that." This simple sentence, clipped and shared, became a mantra for those watching, an insight into the strategic depth behind the calm exterior. It captured the essence of her approach, controlling the response, denying the aggressor the intended outcome. This wasn't just about being composed. It was about a deliberate, powerful refusal to play the victim or to be defined by the aggressor's terms. It was a quiet declaration of agency. The image of Jasmine's stillness in the courtroom, combined with this emerging quote explaining the why behind it, created a potent narrative that resonated deeply. It spoke to anyone who had ever faced subtle disrespect, coded language, or attempts to provoke an emotional reaction in order to dismiss them. Her story became their story, a moment of public validation for the quiet battles fought every day. The emotional ripple effect was widening, connecting people through a shared understanding of what it means to maintain dignity under scrutiny. As the digital firestorm raged, Jasmine remained physically removed from it, preparing for the next day of the hearing. Her communications team, however, was working strategically. They weren't issuing angry press releases or engaging in tit-for-tat on social media. Following Jasmine's lead, their approach was calibrated, measured, and focused on reframing the narrative. Instead of centering the judge's insult, They centered Jasmine's work and her commitment to the issues at stake in the hearing. They shared clips of her asking sharp, informed questions during the proceedings, highlighting her substance and expertise. They subtly drew a contrast between her focus on the actual legal and regulatory matters and the judge's apparent preoccupation with tangential personal remarks. This wasn't just damage control. It was an active reclaiming of the narrative, shifting the focus from the attempted distraction back onto the important public work being done. Requests for interviews poured in. Jasmine agreed to a select few, choosing outlets known for thoughtful, in-depth coverage rather than sensationalism. When asked about the judge's comment, she didn't dwell on the insult itself. Instead, she used it as a pivot point to discuss broader issues. In one interview that quickly gained traction, she used reversal phrasing to great effect. "My focus in that courtroom, and in all my work, is not on personal attacks or trying to score points. My focus is on ensuring accountability, on protecting the public interest, on the complex regulations that affect millions of Americans. Some may choose to focus on performance," she said, echoing the judge's word with quiet emphasis. "But I am focused on results. This isn't about theater. It's about justice." The callback line, using the judge's own word but redefining its context and applying it back to the situation's absurdity, was powerful. It disarmed the insult by refusing to treat it as a personal affront, and instead framed it as a revealing statement about the priorities of the person who uttered it. She wasn't defending herself. She was highlighting the contrast between substance and distraction. This was the beginning of the public reevaluation. People who had initially focused solely on the outrage of the insult were prompted to look deeper, to see the strategic brilliance of Jasmine's response, and to understand the larger implications of such microaggressions from positions of power. They began to see the insult, not just as rude, but as an attempt to derail, to distract from the important work, to diminish the person doing it. And they saw Jasmine's response not as passive, but as a powerful act of resistance, a refusal to be derailed. The emotional reward for the audience began to shift from righteous anger on her behalf to admiration for her strength and intelligence. Her quiet power was becoming a visible force. Maya, watching the media coverage unfold, saw how effectively Jasmine's deliberate approach was shaping the public conversation. The initial viral moment, fueled by emotion and raw footage, was now being layered with analysis and deeper understanding, guided by Jasmine's calm, clear voice. The narrative wasn't being dictated to her. She was shaping it herself, with precision and dignity. The visual symbols from the courtroom, her stillness, her steady gaze, the quiet composure, were now being reinterpreted through the lens of her words. The silence wasn't emptiness. It was strategic containment. The calm wasn't a lack of feeling. It was profound control. The public response was evolving from simple support to genuine intellectual engagement with the tactics of bias and the power of strategic response. The following morning, as Jasmine walked back into courtroom 301, the atmosphere had shifted again. It wasn't just charged with the after effects of yesterday's incident. It was also filled with the awareness that the world was now watching, albeit remotely. Reporters who had secured seats were visibly more alert, their cameras ready, though still adhering to the no-recording rule inside the room itself, relying on capturing moments outside or during breaks. Judge Thompson entered the courtroom, his face impassive. He didn't acknowledge yesterday's events. He simply called the court to order and began the day's proceedings. But the tension was palpable. Every interaction was under scrutiny. When the judge addressed Jasmine, or when Jasmine addressed the court, the silence in the gallery was absolute, everyone leaning forward to catch every word, every nuance. There was no apology from the judge, no retraction, but there was something else. A subtle shift in his demeanor towards Jasmine. He was scrupulously correct, even overly formal. He avoided the casual, slightly dismissive tone he had used the day before. His questions to her, when she rose to speak, were direct and professional, lacking the earlier condescension. It was a tacit acknowledgement, perhaps, that his attempt to diminish her had failed, and that he was now operating under a level of public observation he hadn't anticipated. Jasmine, for her part, maintained her composure. She didn't capitalize on the moment with any grandstanding. She simply continued to engage with the legal substance of the hearing, her questions sharp, her arguments precise. She didn't refer back to the previous day's incident, not directly, but every clear, articulate point she made about the complex regulatory issues served as a quiet, irrefutable counterpoint to the judge's earlier suggestion that she was focused on performance. Her substance was her statement. There was a moment during a break where a senior member of the judge's staff approached Jasmine's table. He spoke quietly to Mr. Davison, but his eyes occasionally flickered towards Jasmine. While the content of the conversation was private, the visual symbolism was clear. The institution was, in its own way, reacting to the public fallout. There was no apology offered in public, but the shift in atmosphere and the subtle interactions suggested that the message had been received. The concept of institutional erasure was relevant here. The system itself wouldn't overtly acknowledge the bias, but its behavior would subtly adjust under pressure. Jasmine's approach of dignified refusal had forced that adjustment without her having to launch an aggressive counterattack. Her power lay in her unwavering presence and competence, which made the judge's earlier remark look petty and irrelevant in comparison. The emotional beat of the public reevaluation was now playing out within the confines of the courtroom itself. Those who had witnessed the initial insult and Jasmine's silence were now witnessing the ripple effect, seeing how her composed strength had altered the dynamics of the room and the behavior of the authority figure. The virality trigger had done its work, creating a global audience that demanded a certain level of accountability, even if that accountability was expressed through a subtle change in demeanor rather than an explicit apology. Jasmine's quiet strength had not just protected her dignity, it had exerted a tangible influence on the institutional space she occupied. The hearing concluded later that week, the final days unfolding under the shadow of the viral moment. While the legal outcome of the complex regulatory case was the official result, for the public, the true story had been the human drama that played out within it. Judge Thompson maintained his professional, if slightly strained, demeanor throughout. He never again made a comment remotely resembling the one that had sparked the firestorm. His interactions with Jasmine were strictly procedural, correct to a fault. It was a form of capitulation, a quiet acknowledgement that his earlier tactic had failed and had, in fact, damaged his own standing in the court of public opinion. Jasmine continued her focused work, her contributions sharp and substantive until the very end. She asked the final clarifying questions. She reviewed the final documents, her presence a steady anchor of competence. There was no dramatic closing statement about the earlier incident, no fiery denunciation. Her striking back brilliantly wasn't a single, explosive moment, but the sustained, unwavering demonstration of her character and capability in the face of a subtle attempt to undermine her. The emotional beat of reflective closure began to settle in. The immediate heat of the viral moment started to cool, replaced by thoughtful analysis. Op-eds appeared in newspapers and online, dissecting the incident not just as an example of judicial misconduct, but as a case study in microaggression, power dynamics, and effective responses. Comment sections filled with debates about whether Jasmine should have reacted differently, only for many to conclude that her chosen path of dignified restraint had been the most powerful response of all. Her silence and subsequent calm reframing had invited deeper consideration, forcing people to think about why the judge's comment was harmful, rather than simply reacting to the spectacle of a confrontation. People shared their own stories of facing similar coded language and disrespect in their workplaces and daily lives, finding resonance and inspiration in Jasmine's experience. The story had moved beyond a single incident involving a public figure. It had become a mirror, reflecting common experiences of navigating subtle bias. The audience felt not just vindicated on Jasmine's behalf, but empowered in their own struggles. The narrative structure had completed its cycle, from the quiet insult that escalated to a public reckoning, now settling into a period of reflection where the meaning of the event was being processed and internalized by a wider audience. The visual symbol of Jasmine's stillness had transformed in the public consciousness from mere lack of reaction to profound strength. Her direct eye contact during moments of tension was seen not as defiance, but as unflinching truth. The expressions on the faces of aides and onlookers, captured in off-screen photos, became symbols of shared understanding and silent solidarity. Jasmine's restraint wasn't just a personal choice, it had become a public lesson. The rhetorical devices employed, the callback lines in interviews, the subtle reversals in framing, had cemented the narrative, making it clear that this was not just about hurt feelings, but about attempts to silence and sideline, and the power of refusing to be silenced. The story concluded not with a legal victory related to the insult. There was no formal proceeding about it, but with a moral and narrative victory. Jasmine hadn't just survived the attack. She had used her response to illuminate broader truths and elevate the public conversation. She won through composure, through focus, through an unwavering commitment to her work and her dignity. In the weeks and months that followed, the incident in Courtroom 301 became a reference point. Legal scholars discussed it in papers on judicial conduct and bias. Journalists cited it in articles about public figures navigating online scrutiny. But perhaps most importantly, people referenced it in everyday conversations, sharing it as an example of how to face disrespect with strength rather than anger. Jasmine herself rarely spoke about the specific incident, preferring to keep the focus on the policy and legal issues she championed. But her actions in that courtroom, and her measured response outside of it, had already spoken volumes. Her story wasn't just about a judge and a veiled insult. It was about the persistent presence of bias in powerful institutions, and the quiet, profound power of refusing to let it define you. It was a testament to the fact that sometimes the most brilliant strikeback isn't a loud retort, but an unwavering demonstration of who you are, rendering the insult irrelevant. The initial eruption in the courtroom had been brief and internal, a shockwave of recognition among those who understood the code. The true eruption had happened online, a decentralized burst of validation and shared experience. But the lasting impact was quieter, a settling of understanding about the power of dignity in the face of disrespect. The story had achieved viral reach, not through sensationalism, but through its deep, human resonance. It wasn't just clickbait, it was a lesson, a reminder that composure is not weakness, and that sometimes the most powerful response is the one that forces others to examine themselves, simply by standing tall and refusing to shrink. Jasmine Crockett had turned a moment meant to belittle her into a moment that elevated a conversation about respect, power, and resilience. She had shown that maintaining one's dignity isn't just a personal virtue. In the public arena, it can be a strategic and profoundly powerful act. The incident became a quiet chapter in the larger story of her career, a moment that highlighted her character under pressure and solidified her image as a figure of strength and integrity. The courtroom had indeed erupted, not just with noise, but with a recognition of quiet power. If this story moved you, share it. Not to go viral, but to remind people what dignity looks like.